What's going on? Zach here with 5-Star Prep, and today we're going to be taking a look at the fourth problem from the 2022 FRQs on the AP Stats exam. Here we got a confidence interval, so let's jump right into it. Question 4 from the 2022 AP Stats exam reads, a survey conducted by the National Research Center asked a random sample of 920 teenagers in the United States how often they use a video streaming service. From the sample, 59% answered that they use a video streaming service every day. A says, construct and interpret a 95% confidence interval for the proportion of all teenagers in the United States who would respond that they use a video streaming service every day. Taking a look at this question, it really shows me that the College Board is doing their best to stay up to date with the times. Again, I look at some AP exams and also SATs, and they try to be entertaining to the best of their ability. Here, I guess they're throwing in a problem dealing with video streaming to do just that. But here we want to create a 95% confidence interval. What type of confidence interval is this? Is it for a mean or a proportion? That's the first thing I'm looking at, and I'm also trying to identify how many samples do I have. Here, it's one sample. They collected a sample of 920 teenagers, and they calculated a mean or a proportion. Well, they tell you directly a proportion. The question couldn't get more straightforward. Here, we are creating a 1 proportion z interval, and that's the first thing I'm always trying to identify whenever I'm given a confidence interval or a hypothesis test question. So here, I'm just going to write that right here, a 1 proportion z interval. And now let's go ahead and find it. So before we create our interval, we always need to check our conditions. Our conditions, which by the time you take the AP exam, you should have written these 1,000 times. Here, for a 1 proportion z interval, our conditions are going to be random sample, a random sample. We also have our 10% condition, which is going to denote independence. And then our large count condition. So here, I'm just going to read through these conditions and tell you what you should have written. A random sample, we just want to make sure that our sample was well designed and random. And it stated directly in the question that this was a random sample, so we're good to go in that department. Here, it checks out. Now, the second condition is the 10% condition. Here, 920 teenagers, the sample that we collected, has to be less than 10% of the total population. Well, there is definitely more than 9,200 teenagers throughout the entire United States. So here, this is absolutely less than 10% of the entire population. So that is good to go. And the last condition we have is our large count condition. And here, when we take our sample, we need more than 10 successes and 10 failures. Here, n times p hat should be greater than or equal to 10, and n times 1 minus p hat should be greater than or equal to 10. And we want to go ahead and verify this. N times p hat in this case is going to be 920 times 0.59. And here, plugging that into my calculator, 920 times 0.59, we're going to get 542.8, which is definitely more than 10. And that means that 920 times 0.41 is going to give us 377.2, which again is greater than or equal to 10. So both of these check out, and therefore our large count condition is satisfied. Now we can go ahead and perform, or rather construct, our 1 proportion z interval. So what you're going to state is, since the conditions are met, we can construct a 95% confidence interval for the true proportion of U.S. teenagers who use streaming services daily. Keep in mind that whenever you're doing a hypothesis test or confidence interval, you're trying to identify a value of the true proportion or the true mean. Here we're trying to relate it to the population as a whole and estimate the parameter. We already have a statistic. So again, here we're trying to take a confidence interval to represent the true proportion of all US teenagers who use streaming services daily. So now that we got that out of the way, here they're always looking for you to identify that you know what type of confidence interval or hypothesis test you are constructing or performing. So I would go ahead and either state that we will use or construct a 1 proportion z interval or write down the formula. Here the formula is going to be p hat plus or minus z star times your standard error. P hat times 1 minus p hat over n. Again, just because you can use your calculator to find confidence intervals and hypothesis tests, that's not enough. They need to know what you did. You can't just write your conclusion and carry on with your day. So here, the formula for your confidence interval is what I just wrote down. And now we are given p hat. P hat was 59% or 0.59. And our value of n is going to be 920. Also, I know that we're going to use our critical value being z star because we always use z's whenever we're dealing with proportions. So here, our confidence interval is going to be created by doing 0.59 plus or minus z star. Here we have a 95% confidence interval. This number should be ingrained in your head by now. It's 1.96. And we're going to multiply by the standard error, which here is going to be the square root of 0.59 times 1 minus 0.59 over n, 920. And that's all we're going to be doing here. So now let's plug in our calculator and get our value. The first thing I like to do is always my margin of error. So I'm going to do 1.96 times my standard error. And my margin of error ends up being 0.0318. So here I'm going to get 0.59 plus or minus 0.0318. Now, adding my margin of error to my sample proportion, I'm going to get my upper bound of 0.6218. And subtracting it from my sample proportion, I will get my lower bound, which is 0.558. So my confidence interval here is 0.558 to 0.6218. So here, we want to go ahead and make our conclusion. We are 95% confident that the true proportion of US teenagers that use streaming services daily is between 0.558 and 0.6218. So here, the true proportion of US teenagers who end up using streaming services daily is between these two values right here, 0.558 and 0.6218. If we move along now to the last portion of the problem, it says, based on the confidence interval in part A, do the sample data provide convincing statistical evidence that the proportion of all teenagers in the United States who would respond that they use a video streaming service every day is not 0.5? Here is 0.5 in your interval. That is all it's asking. 0.5 is not in your interval. Therefore, we have sufficient evidence that 0.5 is not a potential value of the true proportion of US teenagers that use streaming services. So in this case, here, yes. Since 0.5 is not contained in the confidence interval, there is evidence to suggest that here, in this case, more, because our confidence interval is above 0.5, that more than 50% of U.S. teenagers use streaming services. Use streaming services daily. As far as the AP Statistics exam goes, this is a question that you should be accumulating all your points on. You should know going into the exam that there's going to be either a confidence interval or hypothesis test. And when it comes to both of those things, the easiest one they could potentially give you is a 1 proportion z interval. There are so many multiple choice questions surrounded around this concept that you should know this like the back of your hand. And here, you just saw an FRQ related to it. So I hope that helped clarify a couple of things. You'll likely see it in exams to come in future years. So make sure you master it. And I'll see you in the next one.